originally due to open in the Hugh Lane Gallery in April. And indeed, since then, there was a time when we wondered if Worlds Without End would ever even begin. As we know, the onset of COVID-19, with absolutely no respect for any borders, wreaked and continues to wreak havoc across the globe. However, due to the determination and vision of our curator, Sara Reisman, Executive and Artistic Director of the Shelley and Donald Foundation in New York, welcome Sara, and Michael Dempsey, our Head of Exhibitions in the Hugh Lane Gallery, who conceived this exhibition in 2009, and to the artists whose support and positivity was a key in making this happen. Worlds Without End is now installed and due to open on the 10th of October, subject, of course, to government guidelines. And we are really championing for our museums and galleries to reopen. Worlds Without End, Stories Around Border, was created to investigate and raise debate on the increasing proliferation of borders globally and the effects of borderization on communities. Some of the highlighted issues were, in the US, President Trump pledged greater fortification on the US-Mexican border by planning to build a wall right across the border. And in Ireland, the approaching exit from the UK, by the UK from the European Union raises concerns about the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, particularly in light of the Good Friday Agreement. The temporary borders blocking passage of refugees around the world and the increased fortification of national borders justified as protection of citizens is also a huge issue. Since then, and when that was conceived, all communities and individuals have had unprecedented experience of borders in their daily lives, the workplace, socially, and in their homes with the lockdowns due to COVID-19, not to mention personal borders that come with social distancing and for many with no human contact anymore. The artists in Worlds Without End investigate and critique many of the issues around borders, their raison d'etre and their effects on communities. The innovation, energy and vitality of the works provokes debate and reflection on these sobering issues, which have very serious consequences for us humans. But these works are also uplifting as they raise questions as where to go and what to do next. And by doing that, they create movement, as nothing stays the same. And in that movement creates expectation. And in that expectation lies a sense of hope, a hope for the future. Our thanks again to the curators, Michael Dempsey and Sara Reisman, and also to Victoria Evans, exhibitions curator at the Hugh Lane Gallery. To the artists, Lieven de Bach, Elaine Byrne, John Byrne, Tony Cokes, Shido Delat, Dorguez, Abdu Hamdan, Dragna Jurisic, Arya Archepolis, Rags Media Collective, Dermot Seymour, and Mark Wallinger. We are very pleased to present our first online catalogue of Worlds Without End, with essays from diverse viewpoints, from the domestic to the global, and much thanks to our writers, Rehan Ansari, Hugh Campbell, Sara Reisman, and Michael Dempsey. And thank you to Professor Colin Graham, who is moderating today's talk. Colin has before contributed to our exhibition programs, particularly our socio-political strand of exhibitioning, and in particular Artist as Witness in 2016. And finally, thank you very much to Jessica O'Donnell, our Head of Education and Community Outreach, supported by Catherine Neville, for organising today's talk as part of an excellent programme of talks and events relating to Worlds Without End. And please see our website for a full programme of those talks and events. Thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you enjoy today's talk. Oh, I'm Barbara Dawson, by the way, and I'm director of the Hugh Lane Gallery. I forgot to introduce myself.
My name is Michael Dempsey. I'm head of exhibitions at Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin.
My name is Sara Reisman. I'm the executive and artistic director of the Shelley and Donald Rubin Foundation in New York City. Michael and I met also with Barbara Dawson at an exhibition that was on view at the 8th floor. The exhibition comes out of another show, Revolution from Without. So Michael and Barbara had come to see that show and were interested in bringing it to the Hugh Lane.
If we can cast our mind back, I mean, it was a very different mindset we were looking at. We were looking at the US policy on border fortification, but we were also the uncertainty of where Brexit was taking us. Was there a deal? Was there not a deal? Today, we're still in a position where the two countries are edging forward to some sort of relationship that they can maintain, a benign relationship. But now the pandemic has sort of destroyed any of those old notions about how to, in a utopian sense, of how to have a world without borders. And we're learning to cope with that. We've had new borders put up instantly, in Europe. Do we need borders now? It seems to be the case, in that our thinking might have changed. Also, I think this whole idea, the psychological mindset of borderization, has been imposed upon a larger majority, of the population. We all have this sort of idea of being locked in our homes now. Those who are lucky enough to be locked in their homes, that is now a reality of how we're going to go forward.
I came to borders maybe in a different way in relation to the exhibition, in that in Revolution from Without, we featured documentation from a project by Tanya Bruguera called Referendum. And one of the things that she brought up was Trump's border wall will be an issue for Americans. For a lot of us, it was kind of unthinkable that the border wall would be the issue that it's become, and that Trump would be president. The last decade in the US has seen a tightening of security at the US-Mexico border. And that, I think that reflects a major change in US borderization. Worth noting that there's already this rising tide against free movement here in the US.
Yeah.
And
it's like a second tipping point.
Yeah.
I think 9/11 obviously was a watershed moment for the entire world, not just for the US.
Yeah.
And now, again, we're at another tipping point, I think, in how security is tightened up at the borders.
What we're seeing in the US is that the context here is fraught with a rolling back of rights. With Elaine Byrne's artwork, Blazing Worlds, she's looking at Svalbard as a kind of subject of her film installation, and that also has a sculptural piece, a piece of coal that represents Svalbard's product. That artwork explores this location, which is in the archipelago. It's like this free zone, right? So where the Schengen countries have all signed on to the Svalbard Agreement, people are able to move freely there, right, without a passport. So it's this a kind of novel structure. The issue is that location is set to be the treaty is going to be revisited, from what I understand. I mean, an example that's more kind of aesthetic and maybe conceptual is Rax Media Collective's Undoing Walls, which is a kind of visualization of how do you take down or dismantle a wall as an architectural structure. How do you think differently about a kind of civic plan that is put in place to kind of manage the populace, right? It's thinking about like a wall that could be more of a threshold, or it could be porous. So, I mean, those are two works that come to mind in terms of rethinking what the border structure could be.
Of course, the original idea of revolution is not necessarily sweeping away of the old. It's a return to the old, but with new changes. Then that gets me thinking again about revolutions, about returnings and the repeat of history. So the 2 points that I return to, I suppose, in Irish history would be looking at artist Dermot Seymour and his paintings, and you see landscapes of surveillance and British Army helicopters alongside country scenes of cows, etc., etc. So it's this surreal and absurd reality that he was living through. Of course, we had John Byrne, in the commemoration of the Good Friday Agreement, puts up the Border Interpretive Centre around 2000. So it's a way of looking back at these two key points in our history. And now, from John's point of view, back there nearly 20 years ago, we were saying like the Good Friday Agreement, it's done and dusted, we can now move on. But here we are once again, right, looking at this unknown future where we could return.
But I think the question right now, and it is sort of a question that I have about art, is what does it mean to make political art in this moment, or to present it curatorially? To what effect? That's something that I'm thinking about a lot. I do appreciate the fact that in an art context, we can ask certain questions that aren't necessarily welcome elsewhere or not necessarily possible elsewhere. Understanding the kind of marginal spaces where certain kinds of conversations can happen because of art in a political framework. So that's sort of looking forward. I wonder, are there ways that art can change, or should art remain art?
It's not a question of art changing, but it's a question of the role of museums and dissemination of art that needs to change. So I think as curators, we have to start asking the hard questions now of ourselves, as opposed to asking artists to do the job. As we present collections in museums, that how important it is to remember the past. When we look at the artist Dragna Jurisic, she's trying to reconstruct a country that no longer exists, such as that is Yugoslavia in her work. Is it possible that a country can exist in your memory and yet not exist in reality, you know, or does that begin to shatter as well, your sense of identity? So all of these things are important in the role of the museum and what we present to the public.
Yeah, and I think that the idea of like cultural and historic preservation, the idea that art can function as a form of preservation and storytelling. Like the work of Lawrence Abu Hamdan, Walled Unwalled, to me that piece represents a possibility for an artist to do something so deeply critical and incisive around the role of the senses, thinking about sound and its role in sort of political process and political change, also as a kind of form of abuse, right? But he's turned that around in a way that makes us aware of like our own kind of relationship to the senses day to day, and then in a political framework as well.
Now, what came to mind to me there was just that whole idea of war on culture, that how culture is used and weaponized by different ideologies. And so it's important, again, to keep those memories alive and with us in the collections.
Absolutely. Dalat is a collective based in St. Petersburg and elsewhere, and they're known for making banners that almost operate like political slogans on flags.
So for this show, we're bringing in a work on creolization.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting in regards to the relationship between the Irish and English language that has been in debate in the Northern Ireland context.
So, Michael, you were talking about 9/11 and the way that shifted the dynamic of borders around the world. And I think two works in the exhibition address that in interesting ways. Lieven de Bach with his mirror installation. That artwork is an interesting piece because it's this kind of reflection. I mean, it's a reflective device looking at like the role of surveillance in connection with borders. But then you also have Tony Coax's artwork, Evil, Fear, Spectra, and Fake Emotions. And that artwork is a kind of meditation video installation to do with the way in which like border security became a new kind of introduced post 9/11. But both works look at the way that like the Patriot Act, you know, within a month after September 11th, really opened up certain kinds of information access by the US government in a way that, you know, previously would have seemed unthinkable. Think Dorges's artwork, which is a piece that traces pathways of Palestinians in Palestine, Israel, you know, crossing certain borders within the state in order to get to work, but crossing them in these kind of footpaths. So there's, you know, there's some very kind of direct associations with borders and then more conceptual borders that are expressed in the artworks in the exhibition. I came to Dublin to, you know, plan the exhibition with you back in the end of January of this year. And I mean, all of this has changed since then.
So this idea of free movement has been certainly thrown up again. And this whole idea of living with social distancing, there are certainly two artists that come to mind. One is Mark Wallinger. So his video of the arrivals at Heathrow Airport, where you see people hugging and kissing, and all of that's gone now. This social distancing, we have to put our masks on. The other work that I came across also while I was in New York was Arya Archepolis, and that whole idea of the sort of neighborhood basketball court. I wonder, is that still an interaction that's possible today, where you see people crossing the basketball court and having a chat and stopping and then moving on? Does that exist anymore? No, that's already a country in the past.
There is a lot of activity in New York City parks, but I think in terms of like actual games, it's not allowed.
So those two works, although they were made in different contexts, certainly Mark Wallinger regards 9/11 and how that changed airport security. But now airport security has another enemy, that is the virus. And so viewing that now from this distance, it becomes very poignant as to all of the elements and things that we've lost.
That was fun.
It's strange watching yourself. I should point out as well, it already feels a little bit tired, that conversation, Sara. But when was it? Was it end of August, I think? And the world moves on so quickly.
I wonder if I might come in there and start the conversation. So my name's Colin Graham. I'm here in Maynooth University and just outside Dublin. And I'm going to be chairing the conversation. We're going to start with Michael and Sara. We might move out a little bit beyond them to some of the participating artists who've joined us today as well. It's really interesting watching the course of that little film and hearing the two of you talk, because there's a kind of dynamic of breaking down of borders even in that short piece, where in a sense you begin, Michael, in Europe and Sara in the States, and by the end of it, Michael, you're asking questions to Sara about New York. So I wonder if through the process of curating the exhibition, maybe a question for each of you, in the artists that you both individually began to focus on, as you brought them together, did you both learn things from each other about the way you might think about borders and borders in contemporary art? Michael, maybe you could go first.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Certainly, yes, there have been borders broken down through this new reality, this paradigm shift that we're sort of living in. Primarily, I suppose, the borders that have come across from Zoom meetings, talking with you, Sara. Things now can happen a lot quicker. Even though it tends to be sort of flat, the information is exchanged a lot quicker. And that exchange has been very rich, actually. Sara introduced me to new artists that I never encountered before. And I found, actually, while doing the installation and the layout for it, that there's a conversation that goes on it's both diverse and it's also common about borders. And when you place these artworks in space, those narratives then are started to draw out. So I'm sort of anticipating what the feedback would be actually when members of the public can physically visit the galleries and see that. But certainly that was been my experience.
Sara, what about you?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I really wish I could see the show in person, but I think that video that I think Timmy put together really, I think it captures a lot about the installation process, but also the installation itself. I think in terms of borders, what came through in this process that's been interesting is when Barbara and I first met, we met in January or February of 2019. The show was just had opened a few weeks before, and she and Michael came to see the show. And there was initially the idea of traveling the show to the Hugh Lane. And then what became clear was that it made more sense to adapt this concept. Revolution from Without looked at the dynamics around human rights, rolling back rights, kind of artist projects that had highlighted moments of rights being rolled back or advanced, right? But I think it was really important to think about these ideas in the framework of Europe and then in the context of Brexit. So, I mean, I learned, when when I was in Dublin at the end of January to talk about the exhibition, there's certain ideas about borders and borderization that, like, aren't apparent in the context of the US or weren't at that time. So yeah, in the context of the EU and also Ireland in relation to the UK. So it's been educational that way, but also interesting to think about how a set of ideas change across borders and then evolve in a new environment. So,
and what would be the kinds of things, Sara, that you would have in that period in Dublin that you would have taken away that it changed your thinking on, maybe brought from the European context back? What things about borders are about the, I mean, and a lot of this was about the dynamics of Brexit, but.
Yeah, well, what I would actually emphasize has less to do with exactly what was absorbed on that trip. But I think Elaine Byrne's artwork, I didn't know that much about the Svalbard Agreement or how the Schengen, countries interact. And that to me was, that was a very kind of interesting project to research in the writing that I did for the catalog. So for me, that was not, it's not that it was so new, but to go into more depth about the history of the site, and also to connect that in the essay that I wrote, there was some research that generated some knowledge for me. I mentioned in the video, Tanya Bruguera, we had organized a performance for an exhibition several years back in 2016 on behalf of the Rubin Foundation. And she did a performance called Referendum. And I just want to mention it because in that piece, we were basically soliciting people to do a live vote in Union Square Park in New York City about borders. So the statement was, borders kill, should we abolish our borders? Yes or no? And that's when she, she's wagging her finger at us at 2016 saying, this border wall is going to be a problem. Trump's going to be a problem. And it was, kind of shocking. But I guess, it's just to think about border. There's just such a different set of conditions in the context of Europe compared to the US. I don't know if I have a great answer for you, but that's sort of thinking about, like, in the US, there were moments in the course of the pandemic when borders started to shrink, by state, and then they've, opened up again. But there was a sense of paranoia that I think in the US we never, in my lifetime, was never a concern. So these shifts are, it's really extraordinary, I think, in my lifetime.
Thanks. And Michael, I wonder, one of the shared things is a kind of surprise that a lot of us had about the way that borders on both sides of the Atlantic suddenly became an issue in the last few years through different forms of right-wing populism. Is there a, I noticed that thinking about some of the work in the exhibition, there's a kind of an interest in borders disappearing or borders appearing. So when you think about the artwork in the exhibition, how would you begin to categorize the different ways that they understand borders in that kind of moment of suddenly borders being important again in the political discourse in a way perhaps that they hadn't quite as much in before, about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago? Is there a kind of set of tropes or schema that you could say in the different works of art of how borders get understood, or is that too simplistic?
Yeah, difficult one to unpack. From working with the different artists, my feeling is that there is a different idea of what a border is. From literally from symbolic borders to hard borders to political and global economic borders, and so each artist tends to have a different interpretation of what a border is. And as a curator, that's kind of nice. That's kind of, that sort of openness allows us to open up that sort of conversation. Whether borders exist. One thing I learned actually from the American side is this idea that how important the border wall which initially, Trump's border wall that we dismissed as, a joke, a clownish sort of political stunt. But the power of that symbol is what basically won the election, I would say, for Trump. And it's the fear. It's the things that I'm learning about walls and about borders is that it comes about in the last 5 years. This increasing number of borders that have happened comes about through our globalization and the economic goals that we want. Borders are put up for different reasons. We want borders and we don't want borders. And just to come back to Trump again, the symbolic power of that is how culture is used, and it's got me thinking about the importance of how culture is now being used as a weapon, as such, in the political discourse that's going on. I don't know, does that?
Yeah, and you talked a bit in the video about the importance of curation, and also the role of the museum and the art gallery in changing public discourse. And I noted in the just reading the exhibition catalogue, Sara, I think, has a wonderful quotation from Hannah Arendt about the admission of all to the public realm. And it seems very much that to some extent you're both thinking of this exhibition not only in terms of what the artists do and the way that they think about borders, but that the borders of the art world may need to become part of the conversation too, and that taking of the artwork into the public realm and breaking down any border that might exist. And many artists have been working at that for a century now, of trying to break that particular barrier between the art world and the public realm. But when you think about the works in this exhibition, do you think there's a particular way, and this may be a question for both of you, maybe talk about one or two of the pieces in the exhibition where that sense of entering the public realm or changing a sense of what the public realm might be is a reaction to understanding borders and trying to critique or reconfigure borders? Maybe Sara could start with that.
Well, I want to maybe answer this in two parts. Lawrence Abu Hamdan's work is like a form of investigative journalism, or an investigative work that has an activist outcome, or, I mean, to a certain extent it does, through his collaboration with forensic architecture. So I think that he's looking at the issue of what kind of is permeable through walls in the video Walled Unwalled. And through that, there's an example that he describes in the piece about a woman who's killed by her boyfriend through a wall. And you'll have to read the essay, but it's an interesting example of the way that walls can also kind of obscure, in addition to sort of being a fortification, a barrier, protection, it can also obscure certain information that leads to a lack of safety, right? But what I wanted to just mention is, in terms of the role of the museum, I think we're in a moment. I was just on a call earlier with Meryl Lederman-Euclides and Sally Talent, the director of the Queen's Museum, talking about the role of museums right now, and the fact that museums, at least in the United States, are being held accountable in ways that other kinds of institutions are not. And I think there's just a lot of belief in the power of what museums and galleries can do, and what art can do, even though in the United States context, it's often mistrusted, right, as a force, because people don't necessarily understand it as threatening. It's potentially critical. On the other hand, it is a space, these are spaces where we can have this kind of conversation. But I think that there's also a kind of question about whether cultural preservation on its own is enough, or how you kind of connect that to a community. How do you make that meaningful to a community? How do you give access? So I think that's a conceptual wall or boundary that we're looking at. Like, it's not a border exactly, but it's like, does the role of the institution have to extend, the cultural institution that is, does it have to extend beyond this kind of curatorial function? And I think it does, and I think there's expectation all around that that should be happening.
Michael, I wonder about, sorry, do you want to take up that?
I was just going to follow up on that, and that there seems to be a moment now where institutions are under attack. That's bringing up the recently postponed Philip Guston exhibition, and it's been postponed and cited because of the hooded figure paintings, where Guston addresses the white culpability in the Klan, and so I suppose with the context of Black Lives Matter, it's seen to be too toxic or so, and yet the institutions themselves are the places where we can raise these questions. I say that in a sense, like Chantal Mouffe, who would see cultural institutions as a place where agonism can exist, where two opposing arguments can exist, because at the moment, through social media, we're deafened by polarization. It's either one side or the other. And so now I feel that there is a sort of a need for curatorial activism to take place in the institutions and to use that as a form going forward.
Michael, one of your things that was interesting to me in your curatorial decisions in this exhibition was to go back to a couple of artists whose work is not new, but to bring it back into focus again. Dermot Seymour and John Byrne, who differently focus on the border in Ireland. Was there a particular reason for going back to them? Clearly there's a resonance with Brexit, but they both, you mentioned Dermot Seymour's use of surrealism and John Byrne's work. I think he was going to be here, but I don't see him on the list of participants. If he is here, he's very welcome to come in and join in. But that uses humor and satire.
That's right.
Was the surrealism, the humor, and the satire part of the reason that you were interested in bringing their work back to be seen?
Certainly, in John Byrne's work, there is satire. The idea, what you see in the exhibition actually is just it's a display of the archive of a performance that John did in 2000. So that was 2 years after the Good Friday Agreement, and now we're looking at that. That's 22 years ago. Even 2 years on, when John did that performance, there was a space opening up for satire, for comedy, for us to look at ourselves and at how the two communities had moved on in some respect. Whereas before, you would not have been able to, on that border, introduce comedy in that sense. But also there was a sense that during the commemoration there in 2018, we had another show with Amanda Dunsmore. And it's hard to believe now, because it's only 2 years ago, but there was a sense that the Good Friday Agreement was something that was of the past. It was before Brexit really got its legs together and really became the issue that it is like today, where I think the EU is actually taking legal action against the Boris Johnson's bill. And, so back only 2 years ago, it was a sense that it was still in the past. And so by reintroducing John's work, where the commemorative centre, where he pokes a bit of fun at it, at the border, it's to remind us that the border is still with us. And again, why I chose Dermot Seymour's paintings was to try and get that insight into the past. And again, that's coming back to where the importance of museums and collecting memories and preserving those memories, so that we have that insight, because our fickle human memory is just, so short that we need these objects to read and to recontextualize again and again.
I think at this point it would be really interesting to hear from some of the artists who are involved in the exhibition, who are here with us. Some of them I know and some of them I don't, but Dor, Gaz, you're there somewhere, aren't you? And we saw a very short snapshot of your work. Do you mind coming in and joining in the conversation? you're both muted and invisible, so maybe that means you prefer not to.
Fair enough.
Okay, that's fine. I can see Dragona, your message there as well. Dragona, hi, how are you?
I need to unmute myself.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi, Dragona.
Dragona, your work on Yugoslavia, is that something that, in the context of what Michael and Sara have been talking about, this relatively recent reinvigoration of the idea of the border across the world, but particularly in a particular form at the edges of Europe and then internally in Ireland because of Brexit, is it something that makes you rethink the work that you did in U?
Well, I was just thinking now when Michael was talking about John Byrne's work that I really love a lot, and this element of comedy and humor. And I was thinking like, oh God, like I would love a moment in my life when I'll be able to laugh about what happened in the ex-Yugoslavia. But I don't think we are there yet. Yes, I think as artist that's been marked by war and being a refugee, it's kind of, it seems to be that lots of my work kind of goes and revolves around there and trying to understand what happened. And I'm finding it very difficult to pull away from that, even if I try quite hard. It's difficult to talk about other works in the exhibition because I also didn't see anything yet. So
when you say that about getting away from the work, is that a personal thing that you're drawn back to it, or is it that curators particularly are drawn to the work because it seems constantly relevant, and that pulls you back into it, or a mixture of the two?
Well, I think it's both. I think that it's kind of interesting for me with the Lost Country because work hasn't stopped touring since 2013, since I first exhibited it in Belfast Exposed. And I think that was really to do with the time it came out. The book came out in 2015 when there was a huge refugee crisis worldwide. And I think it really resonated. So there is a part of me that wants to escape the work, for sure, because I feel like I'm constantly re-traumatizing myself talking about the same thing, especially when I'm giving talks in particular. But I think, yeah, maybe I just need to honor what's happening right now, and there will come a time when I can move away from that. But I do really wish that I can make some very abstract work about, I don't know, materiality of photography or something that is not so political and, yeah, personal, really.
Thanks. Last time I saw you do a talk, you just told the history of Yugoslavia, and it was one of the most moving things I've ever been at, and I couldn't say why at the end because it was just a straight history of Yugoslavia. So I know that, but thanks, Dragona. I know that Elaine Byrne is here too. Is that right?
Yeah,
Elaine?
I'm here.
Yeah, Elaine, thanks very much for joining us. And again, we saw a brief moment of your work in the exhibition. Do you want to maybe, just in terms of the conversation we've been having, say a little bit about your work and how we should think about it when we get to see it eventually?
Yeah, Sara mentioned something about Svalbard, and the work is really looking at the notions of borders, and as you said, Colin, how they're being reinscribed in different ways. They're not necessarily on the map where you think they are anymore. And Svalbard is a good metaphor for, the call maybe that you sometimes hear for a borderless world, where, I started off the project looking at the possibility of a place like Svalbard where it exists under a very special treaty, where anybody can live there or work there as long as they can look after themselves. So you don't need a visa. So that all sounds very kind of utopian and idealistic, I guess, apart from the fact it is in the Arctic. And until something like COVID comes along, where you do see, and again, kind of referencing Hannah Arendt, which is, if you don't have the power to vote, you can't really say you have a good life. And COVID came along, and so that was subsequently to me doing this work. And then a lot of people had no rights in a place like Svalbard and no protections. So you see, this kind of notion of a borderlessness, it leaves you very unprotected if you've no state behind you and like supporting and giving you those rights. So I think the work even now, if I was looking at it, would have changed now post-COVID as well, and how borders, this notion of borderlessness is so tied to actually your right to vote.
Yeah, and when you were making the work, were you thinking of Svalbard as a kind of metaphor, or is it a nearly utopian place at the beginning of your thought process, and then something that a kind of utopia that disintegrates a little bit over time, or is that I'm thinking of it in the wrong way? Was it just a free space?
No, I was thinking about it at the start as somewhere utopian, until I kind of went there. And then you kind of see that actually it's sometimes you could see it as for some people, it's a holding space. They go there and they end up living there longer than they ever thought, but always planning to go somewhere else or hoping to be somewhere else. And there's 52 different nationalities living there, and there's only 2,700 people. So the whole idea of a one community, one language, one cultural history shared just doesn't exist. So the whole thing of how do you build a community is a very interesting concept in somewhere like that, where nobody really stays there more than 7 years. Some people do, but if you're going through the school education system, the children tend to leave after a certain age and go somewhere where they can finish their schooling. So yeah, it certainly started off as a utopian idea. Could there be more spaces like this? And then you kind of see, well, it could also be dystopian for all the reasons it's utopian in a way.
Could you just, because we saw a very brief section of your work in the video, but just to say a little bit of what the work actually is in the exhibition?
Yeah. Well, I also the exhibition, the video in the exhibition, the installation is 3 pieces: the photograph taken in a cave in Svalbard, a piece of anthracite coal, because Svalbard is an Arctic island that actually never had an indigenous community. But the first community that was there, it's coal mining cities, Russian primarily and European. And there's a video then. The video is a commentary coded video narrative. So that means it's like the video is coded in a way that it's like a deck of cards shuffling all the time. So the video never really finishes. So in that sense, it's borderless itself, And the video is my own footage mixed with footage from various expeditions from Hollywood films going to the Arctic. And yeah, the kind of the what happens when they get there. So
sounds great. Thanks for your contribution, Elaine. I think Dor guys is with us now. Is that right?
Hi.
Hello. Hi. You're very welcome.
You're talking, sorry.
That's all right.
All day, and I just went to have like a granola or something.
I'm very sorry. I got it exactly the wrong moment. So thanks a lot for joining us. And again, Dor, with your work, we saw some brief moments of it in passing. But if you've been listening into some of the conversation, it'd be great to hear from you and your thoughts on how your work fits in or with the exhibition, or on how you those the kind of desire lines, I think, is what we were seeing, the paths of desire, or maybe they're not quite desire lines where people walk in Palestine. Maybe they're lines of necessity. But could you just talk a little bit about that work and how you think it fits in with borders, and particularly for those of us who will be going to see the exhibition, to give us a kind of primer on what we should think about when we get to see your work?
Well, I come from the land of borders and territories, Israel and Palestine. And the work, we are now 20 years after the Second Intifada, and the work was filmed, shot in 2014, relating to the wall that Israel started to build to separate between Palestine, the territories, and Israel. And when I was living in Jerusalem, very close to the border, lots of my friends that used to come to work in Israel just used to cross the border. And one time I asked them, how did you even came in? Because they didn't pass through a checkpoint, they didn't have permission. And we just did the walk. We did it a few times, and one of the times just took a camera. And what looks like a very innocent walk through nature, and maybe something that animals created through walking on the same paths in the field, is basically the daily route for them to make a living and to work. So to me personally, it's interesting in the context of like, really, we are 20 years after the Second Intifada, and it seems like, well, I'm not that optimistic, let's say. It's a different, sorry.
Do you think of those paths when you look at them as something subversive, or is there a kind of pathos to the, I mean, the idea that they might be animal tracks, for example, is in a sense is a kind of forced dehumanization of the people who have to use them. But are they, or is it the kind of inevitability of people just finding a way to circumvent slightly ridiculous officiousness, that there's always a way around the border? It's a bit like the Trump border wall. Unless you build it from one coast to the other and actually into the sea quite a long distance, then it is in effect a slightly useless piece of architecture. And that unofficial path, in a sense, how do you think of that unofficial path when you see it in your own work?
Well, it's true that you can't really create borders between countries, between people, without any kind of agreement. It's a sideway like action from the Israeli side, obviously. And yes, people do cross this border, even though from the outside it looks like it's a very very aggressive kind of act in the landscape. It's not only separating people, it's also separating you mentioned animals that are passing through, like the wildlife between the two countries, and there are many other aspects to it. But these borders, even though they look so like dominant in the landscape and they're really like a scar, yes, people find ways of passing them, and the authorities in Israel are even aware of that. People are passing them. Like I think in many ways the wall is a symbol of power than an actual. If it's supposed to create a sense of security, I don't think it in any way it achieves that. I think it's a symbol. It has a more symbolic value to it than an actual. Like, let's say, actual agreement or actual border between two countries that have any kind of communication between them. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, you did, and I think we live in an era where the political promise of secure borders is based on a threat of insecure borders, and the two go hand in hand constantly. And I suppose my interest in a way is the fact that people can, what we see in your work is that people can pass through borders. Does that undermine the bigger ideology, or does it reinforce it? Does it reinforce the fear, or does it suggest that the appearance of the border, which is often, well, obviously, building a wall is about people seeing a wall. It's not about the function of a wall, and it's beyond the functionality. The ideology of borders seems to be potentially undermined by the fact that someone can cross over it. Obviously that area of the world is full of migration as well, and long patterns and histories of migration and current migration too. So is that something that's in your mind when you're thinking about borders, about that long-term movement of people and how that changes who they are?
It's a big question. I would say that I think that I mean, when we talk about borders, we're talking about kind of frames, kind of like where people, I mean, it's not, I don't think it's about really physical, only about physical movement. I think it's at least in my work, it's very metaphorical. I come from, my mother is Palestinian, my father is Israeli. So to start is Jewish, was Jewish Israeli. So I think my starting point is that in my practice in general, but also as an individual, as a person, is that I don't really understand borders. And when people like ask me, well, what are you? Are you a Palestinian? Are you Israeli? What do you identify? Like, how do you identify yourself? I always find myself thinking, why is that? Why does it have to be a contradiction? This is in people's mind. This is something that is existing outside of, let's say, my home. Because my parents, from my point of view, my dad was born in Tunisia, immigrated to Israel when he was a kid. He came from a very similar culture to my mother. I always said that, I don't know if it's too personal for this conversation, but I always say that if you would have married a European woman, that would be a huge gap. There will be a huge gap between them. The fact that she is Palestinian and is Jewish immigrants, Israeli, doesn't seem to me like a border that exists within the culture, within their relationship, within the house. It's something that was always from the outside. And I don't know. I continue in my mind to different, I think, thoughts. But what was the question?
I think you answered the question beautifully. Actually, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sator. Thank you. I don't see in the list of participants any of the other artists here. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. So I might come back to Michael and Sara. You both in the conversation and in the film that we watched as well talked a little bit about the different light that the COVID pandemic has put on borders and also on how you both think about the exhibition. So maybe as we move towards a finish, you might comment on that a little bit. The way that COVID has changed either how we think about international borders or possibly domestic borders as well, and whether there are works in the exhibition that you would point to that would help us think about those issues. So Michael, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, certainly thinking changed. We've 2 attempts at this exhibition. Originally it was supposed to open last March, and then we experienced in Ireland the lockdown from the pandemic. And that gave you, as events began to unfold, it was very hard. I was writing the essay. I kept on next draft, because events and context changed the way the artworks were being viewed. So that's an important lesson, I suppose, as a curator, that artworks are living things. They're not things that are fixed, so to speak. Also, what came across to me through the COVID pandemic was how borders create, basically they're about inequality. It's about people who have, people who don't have, but the virus basically enforced that realization upon everyone who didn't really have to think about it before. So the fact that you couldn't travel, this wonderful free travel that we were used to, particularly in the art world, that was shut down immediately. So all of these privileges that we've had, you had to come to terms with realizing what is real and what is not. Many times you're caught listening to the radio all the time, and what you hear in the conversation is whenever there's an artist on, be it a writer, poet, or musician, oh, this must be a great time for you guys, to be isolated in your studios and stuff. But it's not necessarily that. From talking to artists, they can't do anything. They're just sort of literally destabilized, and so there's a sense of being in free fall, and that requires time to reflect upon how to make work again, you know. But I certainly don't see it necessarily as this time set aside as a productive thing. It's an enforced borderization that has been put upon our minds, really.
Michael. And Sara?
Yeah, I mean, I have two ways of answering this. One is that I think the work in the exhibition that stands out as far as its meaning changing or having a slightly different effect is Tony Koch's, his artwork, Fear, Spectra, and Fake Emotions, I think is the title. And it's a piece that's referenced in the video that we showed at the beginning that looks at the kind of the terror alert system that was introduced after September 11th in the United States. And then the way that that's evolved to become an instrument of basically producing fear and anxiety, even when we don't actually know what the threat is. Like it's just the color coding system. And when I was writing about the piece and the essay, I had this strange feeling like, am I writing about the pandemic? Like it was almost like I was in New York during the 9/11 era. And so there was a sense of re-traumatization, a term that Dragana used, which I think is something that's happening to a lot of people right now in this context. But as far as how the pandemic affects art and our experiences of art, I think the fact that we can have, I mean, we all get Zoom fatigue, but there is something very meaningful and poignant that we can be together in all these different formations. And that we have to think differently about how art is experienced. If it's about, figuring out a way for spaces to be safe, to appear safe, right? The spaces where we host exhibitions and programming. But the distancing thing, is really changes how we understand or how art affects us, because, the lack of the lack of touch, being contactless, it means that, it's much more interior, I think. Even if we are sitting here together, there's a kind of interior experience or an isolated experience. But I think I'm still hopeful that we can continue to connect in spite of these boundaries that have been laid out before us.
Yeah, and as we've done today, and it's the ultimate COVID art experience is to collect together internationally and talk about an exhibition which none of us are allowed to go and see.
Well, not yet. Not yet. It's up through the end of January, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully it'll be open by the 10th of October if Dublin's restriction is lifted.
Fingers crossed.